You don't wake up thinking about rats until they start winning, until the same corners stay active. The same bins keep getting hit. The same routes never cool down. That's when Los Angeles did something that sounded ridiculous. It rolled out thousands of small artificial intelligence robots meant to pressure rat corridors. The internet laughed. Robot rat killers became a joke overnight. But here's the truth. Cities don't try machines like this when traps are working and routines are normal. They try them when the rats stop acting scared and start acting settled, when the problem stops being random and starts being predictable. And once you understand what these robots were actually meant to do and what the rats were already doing, it stops sounding funny when disgusting turns into daily life. At first, it is just a story you tell someone else. A rat ran across the road. A trash bag got torn open. A neighbor said they saw one in the daytime. It sounds like city life, the sort of thing you shrug off and forget. Then it repeats, and you realize it is not random. The same corners, the same bins, the same strip of pavement near the same food smell, the same hollow space under the same fence. It becomes personal in small ways. You stop taking the rubbish out at night without looking around first. You start double bagging food waste. You stop leaving pet food outside. You avoid certain alleys because you do not want the surprise. In parts of the city, residents began describing it as unbearable, not because everything was crawling, but because rats were getting closer to where people actually live and work. The rodent population was not just there, it was growing, pushing into homes, businesses, and spaces where families should not have to think about disease. That closeness changes how people use a neighborhood. You stop lingering. You stop letting kids play near certain shrubs. You stop trusting the bin area outside your own building. You can hear the shift in complaints. It is not only "I saw one," it becomes "they are in the walls, they are in the bin area, they are near the kids' school, they are behind the shop every morning, they are coming out earlier." Daylight sightings change a neighborhood fast because they tell you the animals feel safe on your schedule. That is why the response mattered. Not as a strange headline, but as a promise. This is a day-to-day problem, and it has to be treated like one. The part people never expect is what happens when the problem stops being rare and starts rewriting your routine. Why the old fixes stopped feeling like fixes. Most people assume the answer is simple. Traps, poison, pest control, done. The reality is that a city is a moving network of restaurants, loading docks, drains, construction zones, apartment walls, alleys, and bins that sit out on schedule. The problem grows inside that network, so any fix that only works in one spot at one moment will always feel late. That is where the usual tools start failing. Traps catch a few, and then the rest change behavior. Glue boards create outrage and still leave the same routes open. Poison can create secondary damage that turns a pest plan into a wider health and wildlife argument. And that fallout makes long campaigns harder to sustain. Even when a tool works, it often works in a narrow window while the corridors stay intact. Meanwhile, the fuel stays the same. Trash sits out too long. Bins do not lock. Doors get wedged open during rush hours. Gaps under gates stay unsealed. Storm drains carry food scents through warm seams. Tiny shortcuts become repeated invitations, and repeated invitations become a stable system that is hard to disrupt with scattered effort. Officials began shifting from killing more rats to breaking the routes. It is not about wiping everything out overnight. It is about making the easiest paths less comfortable so the map stops rewarding bold movement. That sounds soft, but it is actually strict. It forces the problem back into narrower hours and tighter spaces where it does less damage and causes less fear. And this is where the story flips, because the thing everyone laughed at was not built for a chase the way you think. If you're curious how widespread this really is, subscribe and share in the comments whether you've noticed changes around you. The headline that turned into a meme. People did not wait for the full explanation. They heard thousands of rat-killing artificial intelligence robots, and the jokes arrived instantly. Memes stacked by the minute, and clips of rats in neighborhoods ran with captions that made it feel like collapse. Only after the punchlines did the name appear in every post. Los Angeles. Behind the jokes were consequences that do not go viral. A warehouse losing power because wires were chewed again. A kitchen shutting down at rush hour after inspectors found fresh signs. A building manager paying for the same repairs, the same ceiling work, the same emergency callouts. Families seeing movement by the bin area in daylight and feeling that slow worry settle in, because nobody wants to be the person who overreacted right up until they did not. So, what were these robots supposed to do? The plan was not a chase scene. The robots were designed to hold corridors, applying pressure where rats move repeatedly. Not everywhere rats exist. That difference is the strategy, and it is also why the robots are mostly boring to look at when they are doing their job properly. The program treated the robots as presence units, not to replace sanitation or seal cracks, but to make a corridor feel occupied often enough that a bold run starts to feel like a bad bet. The city paired this with practical groundwork too. Better lids, adjusted pickup routines, changes to lighting in some alleys, and reminders to stop propping gates, because pressure means nothing if the ground is still handing out free meals. The first tests happened where costs are counted in closures and outages, but the meme only shows the headline, not the mechanism. And the mechanism is what made the next step feel almost unfair. What the artificial intelligence robots actually do, rodents do not move like a random scatterplot. They prefer edges, seams, and repeatable cover. A fence gap becomes a tunnel. A drain lip becomes a lane. A warm vent becomes a checkpoint. Those repetitions harden into routes, and routes are the part you can actually target. The robots were built to interfere with those repeats. The artificial intelligence label was not meant to suggest a genius hunter. It describes pattern recognition that helps with placement and timing. The system looks for repeated movement in specific corridors, then positions robots where a calm presence will force hesitation. The goal is not dramatic sprinting. The goal is a costly moment that changes the route after it. When a rat pauses, it recalculates. It chooses a longer path, a later hour, a tighter wall-hugging line. When enough animals recalculate enough times, the corridor stops paying off. That is why these units are often called watchers, not because they watch people, but because they hold space that used to be empty. The design choices were meant to communicate one thing. The corner is claimed. Quiet motors, low profiles, movements that feel deliberate instead of playful. Enough variation to avoid becoming background noise, because a predictable dummy becomes invisible. Enough consistency to keep pressure steady, because chaos looks like a toy. And because any single tool would be blamed for everything, the rollout was paired with on-the-ground fixes. Lids that latch, schedules that reduce overflow windows, and small repairs that remove easy access points. It was never meant to be one gadget. It was meant to be layered. Now comes the moment that decides whether this is a gimmick or a system, because one night revealed the first crack. The Night 1 district blinked. It started in places most people only think about when something breaks. Service alleys, loading zones, warehouses, the back-of-house corridors that feed the city while the city sleeps. These are spaces where small failures become expensive, because one chewed cable can shut down an entire morning, and one shutdown can spoil a full day's work before it starts. Crews placed the robots in specific seams, under docks, near drain lips, beside fence gaps, along wall lines where movement had been logged again and again. They did not try to make a show. They aimed for repeat paths. The same way you would place a lock where the door actually opens, not where it looks nice on a brochure. The first proof was not a pile of dead rats. It was hesitation. A route that used to be straight became a route that hugged the wall. Movement that used to happen early began happening later. The busiest moments shifted away from daylight and away from human peak hours. From the outside, nothing looked different. From the inside, the corridor's rhythm changed. Managers noticed it in small ways first. Less fresh sign in the same spots. Fewer sudden dashes at the same hour. Traps that used to catch something every night, sitting empty longer than expected. A vulnerable corner staying quiet long enough that workers stopped bracing for it every time they walked past. This did not mean the rats vanished. It meant the confidence cracked. And confidence is what makes people feel unsafe. Then the real fight began, not with rats, but with the people who had every reason not to trust what was placed near their homes. The fear that could have killed the entire plan. The loudest pushback was not about pests. It was about privacy and consent. People asked if the robots were cameras, if they recorded faces, if they captured voices, if they tracked license plates. In a city where trust can already be thin, those questions spread fast and hard, especially when the devices sit in the very spaces residents already feel are neglected. So the program needed boundaries, limits that could be explained in plain language, changes that residents could actually see. Supporters argued the sensors were tuned toward near-ground movement and heat shapes rather than human-identifying footage. But talk was never going to be enough on its own. The city had to behave its way past it. Some areas demanded dimmer indicators, and lights changed. Some communities wanted placement away from schools and playground edges, and routes shifted. Animal advocates asked what would happen around real pets and wildlife, and the robots were tuned to yield rather than confront. The team also had to admit operational flaws quickly. Heat and dust stressed early models. A few units were vandalized or stolen. One software update caused odd behavior that made people uneasy, and it was rolled back with new safeguards. A broken watcher does not just fail, it teaches the wrong lesson to everyone watching, including rats, because it tells them the pressure is fake. That is why maintenance became the product. Battery swaps, repairs, placement checks, and quick removal of dead units. The presence had to stay credible, and once the city survived that part, the proof had to show up somewhere that jokes cannot erase. The quiet math that spoke louder than memes. City projects do not usually get a single victory moment. They get trend lines. Service calls began to change first. Fewer repeat complaints in corridors with long-standing coverage. Inspections followed. Fewer fresh signs in some back-of-house areas that had been written up repeatedly. Utilities added weight. Gnaw-related damage is expensive. And when the same junction stops failing so often, people notice even if they never read a report. Vendor data offered another angle. Pest control companies track hotspot movement because it affects contracts and cost. When hotspots begin shifting away from the same old seams, the story changes. School facility reports offered another window. Fewer corridor sightings, fewer recurring notes, fewer check this corner every day reminders taped to a staff board. None of these indicators alone proves a miracle. Together, they can prove direction. The most telling pattern was not everything improved everywhere. It was that certain corridors improved in clusters, matching where pressure stayed consistent and where ground routines tightened at the same time. Skeptics pointed to other changes, and they were not wrong. Education campaigns pushed better bin practices. Property managers sealed gaps. Businesses refined cleanup schedules because they were tired of losses, but the same stubborn detail kept returning. Where the watchers held the seam and the routines stopped feeding the seam, improvement lasted. Where either side slipped, the old behavior returned quickly, but the most surprising result was not in a report because the first behavior that shifted was not the one anyone was watching for. The truth is, the robots pressured people first. The phrase rat-killing robots stuck because it sounds decisive. The stronger effect arrived quietly. It showed up as self-correction in spaces where shortcuts had become normal. A worker who used to leave a bin half-closed started snapping it shut fully. A delivery driver who always wedged a gate open stopped doing it. A restaurant manager began timing waste runs more carefully. Residents stopped leaving bags outside overnight when they saw the corridor was being watched. No tickets were issued, no alarms went off. The space simply felt less anonymous, and people behaved as if shortcuts might cost them, not because the robot punished them, but because the mirror was present in the exact corner where the pattern lived. This matters because rodent problems scale through human convenience. When convenience becomes consistent, it becomes a stable invitation. When convenience becomes slightly inconvenient, the invitation weakens. The robots did not fix the city by themselves. They helped remove the feeling that certain corners belong to nobody, which is where neglect grows. Critics called it manipulation. Supporters called it accountability. Either way, the effect was practical. Lids stayed closed more often, doors stayed latched more often, and overflow windows shrank. When those habits tightened, the corridor became less rewarding, which made the pressure units more effective, which reinforced the habits. That is when the story stops sounding like technology and starts sounding like relief you can actually feel in your body. Ordinary scenes. that quietly proved relief. A bakery owner stopped reaching for the broom by the back door at noon. The broom stayed there, at first out of habit. Then it became just a broom again, not a tool for fear. In a school, a custodian erased a long-standing note that staff had stopped reading because it felt permanent. Check the planters at lunch. The planters became normal again. And that is the kind of normal nobody celebrates until it returns. Tenants in an apartment complex noticed night sounds fading. The building still creaked. Pipes still hummed. But the specific scratching that triggers complaint cycles stopped repeating. A property manager kept waiting for the next round of messages and realized days had passed without one. Which is what relief looks like when it is real. In a warehouse corridor, the same service panel stopped being opened every few days. A supervisor noticed the missing interruption before they noticed any statistic, because stability is felt before it is plotted. In some blocks, people simply stopped scanning shrubs before setting down a bag for a moment. That shoulder tension eased without anyone naming it. And that is the point. These are not cinematic outcomes. They are functional ones. And functional outcomes are what residents actually want. Of course, no city stays stable without the weeks that test everything. And those weeks nearly exposed the weak point, the weeks that tried to break it. Heat waves hit, and hardware struggles. Storms shift waste patterns overnight. Construction blocks corridors and forces routes to change. A festival weekend produces piles of food waste at the worst hours, and turns one night into a fresh lesson for animals that learn fast. Those weeks were the stress test. If watchers went down or were misplaced, bold routes reappeared. If lids were left open and doors wedged again, activity returned quickly. The program learned an unglamorous rule. Dead units cannot stay in place. A broken watcher becomes background furniture, and background furniture becomes permission, so maintenance became urgent. Repairs before failure, battery swaps on schedule. Rotations when corridors shifted, removal when units went offline. Teams treated upkeep as the real intervention, not the shiny hardware. Because shiny hardware does not hold a corner at 3 in the morning. They also treated public feedback as part of performance. If people felt uneasy about placement, placement changed. If an update produced strange behavior, it was rolled back. If vandalism rose, partnerships tightened and routes were adjusted to avoid creating targets. That kind of adjustment is what separates a program from a headline. Over time, the robots stopped being a joke and started being infrastructure. That leaves the final point. The real lesson is not robots. It is how a city applies pressure without losing legitimacy. And after all of that, here is the real takeaway, because the lesson is bigger than robots. And it applies anywhere. The blueprint hidden behind the headline. If you strip away the meme language, the blueprint is straightforward. Identify the corridors where the problem repeats, then apply consistent pressure there. Pair that with ground discipline, lids that latch, timing that reduces overflow windows, repairs that close predictable gaps, lighting that removes easy cover. Without that, any presence becomes decoration. Write limits clearly, so people do not have to guess what devices collect. Trust is part of performance. Expect mistakes, weather, vandalism, and adaptation. Build fast correction into the system, and document those corrections in plain language, because secrecy turns maintenance into suspicion. That is why people laughed at the plan. The headline made it sound like theater. The truth is, it was a city admitting that old tools were not keeping up, and choosing a system that tries to rewrite daily life, one corridor at a time. Only after that point does the location matter. And that location is Los Angeles. You do not have to love robots to understand why this mattered. The city was not trying to win a meme war. It was trying to give residents a normal week, where the bin area stays quiet, the alley stops feeling like a gamble, and businesses stop paying for the same damage on repeat. Whether the program keeps scaling or shifts into something new, the lesson stays sharp. Pressure only works when it is consistent, maintained, and paired with habits people follow. If you have a corner near you that has turned into a daily problem, tell me what it is and what you think would fix it. If this helped, hit like, subscribe, and stick around for the next one.